One thing that game designers really should know is that, it's about the player. It's a player-centered experience, and the player is the one driving that experience. It's the difference between being on a roller coaster and being in a car behind the steering wheel. Now that player, because they're holding the steering wheel, they're responsible for where they go. They have choice. They have decisions to make. And because of that, they take ownership. And that totally changes their relationship to whatever it is. The fact that they were the ones that decided to steer left or right. And because it went off the cliff, it was their fault. Or because they, won the lottery, they did it because they picked those numbers. So I think that that's the first and foremost thing, is that when somebody feels like they're in control of a process, they own it. And it now has a fundamentally more personal connection to them than something that's one size fits all, here's the ride, get on it, hope you enjoy it. Flow is kind of a state that the player can get into, and I think of it as basically something that's right at the limit of your abilities. It's pushing you mentally, but it's not too easy, not too hard. If it's too hard, it seems random, it seems arbitrary, it's frustrating. If it's too easy, it's predictable, it's boring. Flow is putting you right on that edge of your abilities and really testing them. I used to actually race cars, and there was kind of a rule of thumb in racing that if you didn't crash 10% of the time, you weren't trying hard enough. You need to design the game such that failure is interesting and understandable so that you go back and say, aha, now I need to avoid the turtles or whatever it is in the game. And then you kind of build and grow that model. But also you're building your ability to problem solve and strategize. Every player is going to be different abilities, different skill sets. In a lot of ways, you want to make the game such that the player is the one adjusting the difficulty. They can choose to go a little bit further, try for this harder thing, or stick with the easy stuff until they're more comfortable. So in some sense, a lot of it can be kind of player-paced. There are more advanced systems that are called DDA, or dynamic difficulty adjustment, where the computer behind the scenes is kind of watching what the player's doing. And if they're failing too much, the computer can actually lower the difficulty level or increase it, if they're not being challenged enough. But in a lot of games, by giving the player enough freedom, but also enticing them to try for the hard things. If you try for this harder thing, you might get this bigger reward. So at that point, the player can kind of choose their own level and put themselves in the flow state. There is a whole topic known as failure-based learning, and, we have this, failure is a loaded term, in that we think of failure as bad. I don't want to fail. There was a great story I heard. It was an art teacher in an art class. It was actually a pottery class. And at the beginning of his class, the beginning of the year, he divided the class into two halves. And the first half, he said, okay, your final grade is going to be based upon one pot that you make. I want you to make the best pot you could possibly make, and your grade's going to be based upon that. The other half of the class, he said, okay, your grade is going to be based on how many pots you make. I don't care how bad they are, just the more you make, the better your grade. At the end of the year, of course, it turns out that the half of the class that was building the most pots were also building the best ones by far. They had built so many bad pots and had iterated so many times, they learned very rapidly, and by the end of the class, they were building these amazing pots. Whereas the other half that was spending all their time thinking about the one pot that they were going to build, never got anywhere. So it was the failure that accelerated their learning on the other half. When players play games, again, they are failing most of the time. And again, if you can make that understandable, humorous, enjoyable in some way, then that can be an enjoyable process, especially when you get past that first failure to the next level. So as a designer, we're constructing this middle model in the player, and it's important that we ramp that model up smoothly and gradually for the player. You don't want to pile all this complexity on them right at the beginning of the game. It's overwhelming. You should actually present them a simpler model. They can start building from that simple model layers and layers of complexity onto it in their head as they encounter more and more things in the game, either through more elaborate world items, monsters, opponents, abilities, tools, whatever. So the designer, in some sense, is responsible for ramping that model in the player's head. Now, when you're playing an interactive experience, you're actually going through this set of kind of nested loops of success and failure. When you first start playing Mario, you start mashing the buttons and you find out that that button makes him jump. This control makes him move, side to side. Uh, about 10 seconds for you to kind of figure that out. So there's a kind of 10 seconds, I don't know how to control Mario. Then I succeed and finally know how to control him, which brings me kind of to the next level of interaction, which is maybe more a minute. I start encountering objects in the world. Is that good? Is that bad? I learn from that. And then you go from kind of the very tactical, very granular, to longer and longer loops of success and failure. Now, at every level, you're probably going to encounter failure, and the failure actually is something that most people are spending most of their time in a game failing, really. In different ways, in different loops here. And it's not that you don't want the player to encounter failure, but you want them to understand the failure and build a model around that failure so that next time they will succeed. That's part of the motivation, is now I understand that that's good and that's bad. Next time I will not get stuck by that. Let me show you an example of that on the whiteboard here. In a game like The Sims, basically you have little characters that you're controlling here. And initially you need to understand, first of all, just how to make them move and walk around and interact with things. So in some sense, that's kind of like the very first game loop we're dealing with here. On one side of that, is failure. And, this is me not being able to control my character. And once I learn how to make them walk around, interact with things, then I've succeeded. And this is, this is called interaction loop, After that, I start dealing with, they have these little needs. They get hungry, they get tired, they want social, they want entertainment, and those things fail. So right off the bat, they're sitting there and they're crashing on energy, they're bored, they're basically unhappy. And so the next level loop I really have to kind of do is figure out how to bring their happiness up. So that's kind of like the happy loop. And that's a little bit longer time scale. That takes several minutes within The Sims. And again, there's kind of a success side to that and a failure side to that loop. Now, there are also things, within these loops, and we kind of keep going. The next one might be economic. At some point, they want to start improving their house, getting a job, getting skills, So let's call that jobs, and that's an even longer loop here. But a lot of games like The Sims or creative games, also involve basically orthogonal creativity. So in addition to playing the game, in addition to kind of dealing with all these game loops, I'm doing just weird stuff like telling a story with this, or trying to replicate my family, or just exploring, seeing, I wonder if my sim can do that. And so there are probably, other loops that are in a different dimension really than this, kind of more like there, that don't have a lot to do with me succeeding on the overall game success curve, but have more to do with the player exploring their own creativity, their own expressiveness. And some players, get totally invested in this and eventually start ignoring that, But most games have some version of these different loops, and it might be learn to shoot, then learn to unlock the door, then learn to defeat the evil boss at the end. This is pretty much, the same graph of the player building up this mental model. So the player's, model, the player's up here controlling this game, and in their head, they're basically building this mental model, kind of one layer at a time of your game, and those layers of that model very much aligned to these interaction layers. As players are going through these loops and slowly building this model, again, really, it's that most of what they're going to experience is failure. Again and again and again, which doesn't sound very fun, but it's the game designer's job to present that in a way that it's entertaining and informative, and that it's not frustrating. I don't want to be failing on exactly the same thing over and over and over, especially when I know why I'm failing. Some games, some platform games, you have to time it exactly right, and it's really hard, and those kind of get very frustrating. When you know that you have to acquire the skill and you can't quite acquire it, so you're not failing because you don't know what you need to do. It's just that it's so hard for you to kind of get into that skill set, that sweet spot for some people. It becomes frustrating. So when somebody fails in a game, you want it to be understandable. You want it to be something that they can overcome once they understand it. Also, again, humor, can be a great tool to alleviate the frustration. When somebody fails in a certain very basic thing in the game, sometimes you want to actually have a variety of failure states that become humorous. So at least when they're failing again and again and again, it's not exactly the same repetition over and over. You know, you might just have different animations for the same failure. But again, humor I think can be a great tool here. But if presented right, you know, players get very motivated when they understand why they failed to then go back and do it again. The kind of games I tend to make tend to be more system level games. And, you know, they all frequently, like, you know, SimCity or The Sims involve you constructing something that, you know, gets more and more elaborate over time. As you achieve success and your city grows or your Sims, you know, get more stuff in their house, you're adding more complexity to their world. You know, in The Sims, there's kind of this promise that, oh, you buy this crap for your Sims and it'll make them happy. Get them a big screen TV here or a better bed there. But in some sense, as you acquire more and more of these items, they become time bombs. Each one of these things has a failure state or some maintenance requirement or whatever. So as you fill your house with all this junk, what you're really doing is these things are potential time sinks down the road, which add complexity to their world and make it much more difficult to play the game. Same in SimCity, you know. First you're just, you know, zoning a few little plots of land and building a few roads, and you see a few things pop up, and pretty soon they need power. Okay, you give them power. Now they need water. Now they want a school. Now they want a hospital. Now, you know, and so as they make progress in the game and the system is growing, the complexity is growing as well. And so it's a very natural, smooth ramp in complexity. It's not like, okay, you finished level 1, now here's level 2, where we're adding 2 more rules. It's, you know, very smoothly based upon, and in some sense, the player's asking for it. You know, as the player, you know, gets their city to that size, of course they need a hospital now. So it totally fits in. It doesn't feel arbitrary either. It kind of feels natural in that way. It's not just how much difficulty is in the path, but also how many paths are there. You know, I think that the really interesting games are ones that allow different paths towards some kind of success. And in particular, the kind of games I do don't even make success that explicit. You know, in The Sims, you can decide you want them to have a good job or want them to be happy. Same in SimCity. You can want, you know, the biggest city you can build or the happiest residents or least crime. So in some sense, the player is choosing the goal state. Now, each one of these goal states is going to have kind of a different path of difficulty. And so for me, it's more about there's a landscape here of paths that the player can take, and each one has different peaks. But none of these have a cliff where you hit the cliff and all of a sudden, you know, now it's really hard to get up. You know, they all have kind of different moderations of slope up those achievement peaks. And that's something that, you know, again, it's really hard. It's an emergent property, so it's very hard to just say, okay, here's how we code that. A lot of times players will find exploits around it, or it'll turn out that, you know, again, pressing the red button is not that obvious. So this is, again, something we actually will capture metrics on. We will actually have a lot of people, as we start getting more and more testers, we're capturing metrics. How long is somebody spinning in that stage or this stage? How many people are failing on this point or that point? And so that's stuff that you all want to make fairly parametric that you can adjust fairly granularly in testing. Rewards in a game can come in many forms. You know, there's just the advancement, how far did I get in the game, or there's special abilities that you might gain that now allow you to achieve things you could not achieve before. I think sometimes rewards are a little overly relied upon. You know, when you have power-ups and stuff in a game, it's just, it gets, you know, rote, boring, a little too obvious. I think a lot of the really interesting player rewards are things that they think they came up with themselves, or they discovered this thing in the game. And I think discovery is a huge part of this. Is that if you leave areas of the game that are maybe closed off to the player, but at some point, you know, just open one of these little gates and let them see that, hey, there's a lot of stuff hidden in here if you look a little bit deeper or try a little bit harder. And players love that. You see things, you know, people playing Grand Theft Auto or whatever, and they manage to get on top of places where they weren't supposed to be able to, or do things, exploits. Then, of course, they make a movie of it, and it becomes kind of a machinima of sorts. I remember back in SimCity 2000, which is a very old game, we had, you know, of course, landscape, terrain, rivers, you know, but we'd actually programmed in that, you know, once in a very, very seldom while, like if you were playing the game for 100 hours, it might happen for, you know, a few seconds in 100 hours, we actually had this little Loch Ness monster appear in the water, pop his head out. And there was a kind of rumors amongst the players that I think I saw a monster in the water. And no, I've never seen that. Somebody once eventually got a screenshot of it. it was like this very hard to achieve reward, just kind of capturing a screenshot of this one little thing. And it didn't help them in the game at all. But they were so motivated to do this and capture it that it became actually a lot of players were trying to discover and take a picture of the Loch Ness Monster. Rewards are just a mechanism in a game that you put in there, maybe to help guide a player in a certain direction or achieve certain levels. But the incentive in a game really is coming from the process of the player playing that game, whatever that is. And I think that's something that's coming internally from the player, not externally from the game designer. But the process that they're going through, and it might be a creative process, it might be a skill-based process, it might be a social, kind of challenging process. That's something that the player kind of innately has a desire to achieve. And that's a much, much broader thing, and it's a much deeper thing too. I think that's why people really will get really hooked on a game is their own internal incentive. I want to get to level 30 in Warcraft or this or that. They come up with their own goals really for that. Rewards in a game are really like these little mechanisms that the game designer puts in there to kind of moderate the gameplay. So I'd say they're very, very different things. And the player incentive is really the much more important one.